Today we want to have a look on how to build a Go microservice using GoLand. To do that, I created a project already, which is a simple hello world using HTTP handler. But I'm obviously not going to go through all these steps to do it. You will be able to get the recording out at the end of this and go through the code as well. Before we start, let me make this IDE a bit nicer for you all to see and convert it to my usual work environment using the Zen mode. In case you wonder what setup I have, I'm currently running on Windows. I'm going to use Docker and Kubernetes that are running on Windows. And for the IDE, I'm using the latest version, 2020.1.2, with just a few plugins installed, among which one that will be able to show you which actions I'm using when I'm pressing shortcuts called the Presentation Assistant. And this one will show you shortcuts at the bottom of the screen. Shortcuts are available for Windows and Linux and for Mac OS. Okay, so with all the setup out of the way, let's see what we want to do today. So today we want to take this service from a hello world, convert it to a service that talks to a database. And in this case, I'm going to use PostgreSQL. And then I'm going to use JSON to reply with something from that Postgres database to our consumers. Finally, we'll also run this into what could be a development environment or even staging or production using Kubernetes. I created this project using our Go modules support, and you can do the same using the file new project or using the wizard at the beginning of the IDE launch. You can select Go modules, and then you simply point it to the location. If you don't have Go already installed, you can install it either from a local source or you can download it from the internet. Set some environment variables for the project, especially the Go proxy values, for example. And you don't need to worry about vendoring mode as of Go 1.14. So all the setup steps are in place now. Let's switch to our project. So when I switch to the Zen mode, one thing that it hid from us, it's the project tool window. And in the project tool window, if I bring it on the screen, you can see that we have a few files that are created ahead of time. I created these mainly because it's boilerplate code and it's repeatable. So once you will have these, you will be able to replicate this in your setup as well. Keep in mind that everything that you find here, it's still for a demonstration purpose, and you should not run it in production without checking with your company for security and so on. We have a few files that are, for example, the database and web YAML files, and those are the Kubernetes deployment files. The Docker file, which also has a Docker debug, Docker file debug, which will assist us for Docker, and our Go mod file. Let's start with deploying our database to Kubernetes and see how that works. And once we do that, we'll be able to switch back to Go and actually do some coding. One way to do this would be to go with the mouse and so on. And another way would be to invoke the navigation bar. And you can use the shortcut, of course, for it. And then you can say, oh, I want to go to this navigation bar and say, I want the database YAML file. If we look at this YAML file here, we see that it has the regular content of what you'd expect for a Kubernetes deployment to be for a database. It's a stateful set, it contains some config, and it contains a service. But there's no way visible to run this. We can go to the plugins section in our settings or preferences and search in the marketplace for the Kubernetes plugin. Once we find the Kubernetes plugin and we install it, we are then given the option to actually make the YAML file a bit more useful. by having some assistance from the IDE. What you've seen here is me installing a plugin and not having to reload. And this is available for some of the plugins already in the marketplace, with others being converted. You do require to have the latest 2020.1 release in order for this function to work. Okay, moving on. So now we see that we have some gutter icons, and we may be familiar with these from our Go coding. For example, we can navigate around, or we can even run the file. So let's run the file in the Docker context that I currently have configured. This will bring up the services tool window. This service tool window is the place where we can get information both about Docker and about Kubernetes. But unfortunately, I don't want to have to share my screen between the editor and the service tool window. So what we can do is come here to the option menu and select the view mode to be a window. Once we do that, it's going to be basically a standalone window that we can switch between with using the window manager in our operating system. And we can also navigate around the contents much better. So for Kubernetes, GoLand offers you an overview of what your cluster contains. And in this case, you have workloads. And in the workloads, you can see the pods that are running, deployments, stateful sets, and so on, as well as their status and if they're ready or not. You can see storage, for example, and see if there's any storage attached to your cluster. You can see the configuration, including all the namespaces that are available, as well as some network information and, for example, what service is running and where. So it looks like our deployment succeeded and everything is up and running. Our pod seems to run and everything should be fine. We should be able to connect to the database. So let's connect to the database. How do we do that? If we go to the services, we'll see that we are exposing the port 30,432, and this is just a random port I selected during the deployment. How do we connect to the database? You'll say, do I need a separate application or something like that? And the answer is no. GoLand offers the functionality that you can find in DataGrip, our database-focused IDE. And if you come to the side panel here on the right side, which is the default place for it, you'll be able to configure the database, this data sources properties. And in this case, I will make this a bit bigger. And sorry for doing all this resizing. You shouldn't need to do it, but custom resolution for a webinar. The important part is that we are running this database support for multiple database providers. So for example, we support Amazon Redshift, we support MongoDB, we support PostgreSQL, Oracle, MySQL, SQLite, and so on. And what we are interested in right now is our PostgreSQL support. What you've seen me doing is using the speed typing feature, which allows you to quickly filter through lists. So whenever you use the IDE and there's a list, perhaps you can actually quickly type where you want to go, and the IDE will do the filtering and navigation for you. So let's create this. We have the Postgres login information pre-filled. We know that the port is a bit different. And we are going to use a username and password that we configured ahead of time. I want to configure the database as well in this step, and then I want to test the connection. And as you can see, we get a green indicator that everything looks okay. What we can also do is, beyond configuring options and other advanced settings, we can also navigate to schemas and have an overview of all the schemas that are available for us. And in this case, we'll see that there's the default Postgres schema and there's the GoLand schema, which we created. And in this, we are interested only in the public part because we'll use that a lot for our application. So let's configure to view only this, leaving this other information out. Once we do this, the IDE will bring up the database console here and the editor for us to run queries. And what you see here happening with the Gopher progress bar is the IDE indexing the database. How does the index work for the database, you may ask? Well, for the databases, we actually are able to infer the tables, and for each table, all the properties that they have for columns and so on. And we can also, for example, look at sequences. GoLand, as I said, includes all the features that you find in DataGrip, which means that you can also quickly have a look at the data editor, so you can edit and view the information in the database that you have, or you can use the source editor, or you can use the other features that we have for navigation and so on to actually either edit the table or to make either an export or anything like that. So you can right-click on this for more information. You can also modify the table in a visual manner, and this will bring up a tool window that allows you to do that. We are not going to do this anyway today because our table is already configured. So let's go back to our project and bring back the navigation bar and say that we want to navigate from our database console to somewhere else. You can see that you can actually do that, right? Okay, how do we bring back our files though? Well, for our files, we can invoke the navigate to file, and we can say, show me the database YAML, because this one contains one more useful information. All the database that you'll see here is configured through this import script. The import script that you find here in its SQL is actually part of our project, if you had a look on the project overview. And once we select that and invoke the go to file, we can automatically go to that file. Now, I'm not going to keep the database definition there, but just know that you can read this file and configure it however you want so that you can actually customize your microservice. Another useful option that we have from DataGrip is the fact that you can use completion here, for example, to write your SQL statements. All of this being done, we can go back to editing some Go code, and let's go to our main Go file. So let's turn this into a service that connects to a database, right? We've seen the database up and running. We've seen that we can connect to it safely. Let's make sure that we have something that talks to the database from the Go side. To do that, I'm going to use the SQLX package, and there's a function in it that I know it's called SQLX.connect. Now, the IDE will tell me there's nothing that I can do here. There's a red import here. So the way I'm going to do this is going to expand the imports, and then I'm going to add automatically the SQLX package. In the process, I'm going to rely on GoLand to complete the import package path. Also, because I know I'm going to connect to the Postgres database, I will import the driver for Postgres, and specifically in this case, I'm going to use the libpq driver. Now, both imports are red, and you'll say, wait a minute, but you said you're like completing and so on. GoLand will also need to synchronize the project, because right now, if we are looking at our Go modules file, so if we go here, and we haven't touched it so far, this is going to show us an empty file, right? It's going to be the default Go module file for a project. There's nothing useful there. So there's no way for GoLand to actually know which dependencies our project relies on. So let's use the synchronized dependencies of our project action and allow GoLand to invoke the Go tooling to download everything. And you will find the commands that GoLand executes. If you expand the setup area here where it says Go setup calls, you will find this throughout running your application, debugging it, or throughout testing. And you can see that we set the Go root to be Go on 14.2 in this case, and Go path, that's the Go path I have. And we run this command, go exec mod tidy to tidy up the packages and so on. Right, so there is a typo that I have here. And well, there's only one way to really solve it because GoLand can only do so much. I'm going to use the proper package name. Okay, so moving on. We have to provide a driver name, in this case, PostgreSQL, and we have to provide a data source. But for the data source, I haven't created it, so let's create it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a live template, which I defined in my previous projects. And with this live template, what I'm able to do is I'm able to expand this into a full-blown string, because I can never really remember how the connection to the database should be done. So I know that this information is correct. I want to use this username and password, but here I want to use a placeholder because this is going to be useful when we move to a Kubernetes cluster where we don't necessarily hard code the path to our database. And the port looks okay, the database name as well. So I said I'm going to move this to a database cluster, and I have a placeholder. What that means is that I will probably have to get that information from somewhere. And let's say we are going to take this from the environment. And I'm going to use for that a db host variable. And I can either let GoLand import the OS package, or I can do some typing, or I can say get env, sorry for that. And the IDE will automatically import everything. So because I didn't have the correct name in the first place, GoLand can do it better for me and not worry about case sensitivity of function names. Let's call this db host. Now, if this one is empty, I do want to have a fallback, and I'll try to connect to the local host. Then I want db host to become localhost. Right. And now the final step would be to go back to our data source here and say, I want to printf this. One way to do it would be to go in front of it and type and so on. Another way would be to have dot and then press Control space twice, not once, as you see on the screen, and start typing as printf, which will automatically import the FNT package and select the correct function for us. So now all I need to do is use db host here, and that's it. Okay, so moving on. Another thing that I will do here is that I need to handle the database somehow. So if we go at the end and say var, we can actually get suggestions for how we should name this. So let's name it db, and well, it's an error value, so let's name it error. And if I have to type the if whole error and so on, it's not going to get us fast anywhere. So I can use the if template here, or I can use the error.notNew, which I like more. And then I'm going to say log.fatal line and then error. And I usually wrap this using the log package. Now, GoLand wasn't sure which log fatal function I want to use because there are two of them and they have the signature that corresponds to my usage. So it asked me, do you want to import the log one or you want to import the one from App Engine? And I want to import the standard library one. And in this case, it knows even better than I do where the package and function name is. Okay, so moving on to where my code is, I also missed handling this one here. So I can just say I want a variable here as well, and I'm going to name it error as well. And the IDE automatically added the correct sign for me. So again, not nil here. And then have the error handled. And that's it, we handle errors. Cool, so with this in mind, let's actually connect to the database from the handler and do some stuff. How do we do that? Well, let's make it so that we read a visitor from the database and write our visitor ID. And it's going to be a simple service, but it's going to give you all the building blocks that you need to actually create your own complex services. What we'll do is we have this visitor ID that we set with 0. And then I want to connect to the database and run a query row. As you can see, I don't need to type the full name of the function or even all related things. I can just type QR and that's it. And now I need to type my query. Because it's going to be a bit longer, I'm going to split it on multiple rows. So let's do that and start typing. So it's going to be insert, and GoLand automatically knows that I'm connecting to a database to run a query, so I should get completion out of it. And this is available for SQLX and the standard database SQL package. But improvements are welcome. So for any other Go package that handles database interfaces, let us know in the comments on our blog post or send us an issue and tell us if we need to support another package as well. Okay, so back to our writing code. We completed SQL, that's easy and nice, but what happens next is that I need to complete visitors, and the IDE knows that for me. So I do that. And then what can I do here is that, well, the IDE automatically knows the database fields since it had to index them earlier, and I get completion here as well. So it's pretty much writing itself at this point almost. And I'm going to complete with now, and I'm also going to return the ID field because I would like to read and reply back with that field. Cool, so that's done. Let's go back here and say we want to insert the user agent, right? So RUA. And after this is done, well, let's make it on the next row to be easier to read. And I want to scan this into our visitor ID. Perfect. And let's handle the error here. So it's going to be just error, so I don't need error 2 in this case. And when I want to handle this error, I definitely don't want to throw a fatal error here. I will probably just want to return something like a internal server error or something like that. So it's going to be right header, status internal server error. And it's going to be, let's write a message to our clients saying something like internal error. Now GoLand knows that this should be a slice of bytes, but I'm too lazy to write that, so I let the IDE do that for me. And I'm also jump back one row and type F2 so that, well, I handle that error. And then I go back here to actually be able to say, well, this is unhandled. How do I handle it? Well, I have the shortcut here. I'll shift enter, or I can press and link, and I handle that error. Cool. So that error is handled now, and we can return from here. Let's make this a bit easier, and let's say write a status of OK here. And And what else can we reply? Well, we can reply the visitor ID, right? So let's convert this to a printf as well. And well, I should give a parameter and then go back here and so on, but I can do all in one step. I can go back here and I say add formatting string argument. So this is going to add a formatting string argument based on the type that I have. So in this case, I'm going to say visitor ID. And well, that's it. I can navigate with F2 to the next error and say, well, this is redundant. I don't need it. I can just delete it. And I think that's about it. Like we have what would look like a microservice, like a Lambda service if you want. It connects to a database. It handles a function. Let's see if it runs, right? So let's deploy it. To do that, let's go to our web.yaml file. And this is not an error. It's actually our web.yaml file. You can see it here. And it's not colored as the database YAML file because it's empty. So I'm actually going to write our Kubernetes deployment here. And I know this can be complicated and so on, and especially if it's your first time using Kubernetes, it's going to be a bit scary. It was in my case. But I can just say kdep, which is our live template for Kubernetes deployments. And we have a few others as well, like there's service and config map and so on, but we need kdep in this case. And let's say I'm going to type this as web. I'm going to let's give a name to this, perhaps something like Docker dev. Okay, let's go with Docker dev. Latest. And I don't want to pull the image. I will say this to never. So with the Kubernetes plugin, you also get some functionality that you are used to writing Go code, and it's applicable to this part as well. And once you learn how to use it in Go, you can use it in other languages as well. Cool. So I have the container. Now I also want to have a port that we expose, right? And some environment variable that we said we'll expose. So let's go with the environment. Call this db host, and let's call this value. Well, I know the value ahead of time, so I'm going to cheat a bit on this one. Docker dev db. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go here and say I want to complete the ports, and my container port is going to be 8080. And that's it. For now, it should be fine. Everything else is okay. The other thing that I need to do, and this is where we see our multiple definition in a single file feature for Kubernetes files. I want to use a Kubernetes service. So just like that, I wrote a Kubernetes deployment. All I need to do here is be careful on the ports. And for example, in this case, I want to use a node port, yes. I want to target the port 8080. I want to have a node port of 3800. And let's give this a name as well, because why not? And call it web app port. Okay, cool. So my deployment is done. Let's see if this runs. I'm going to go to the run button again, and you may see this in other places as well, like the main function or the test functions. And I'm going to create that, but I don't have anything to deploy, right? There's no Docker file that I created or Docker image that I have run and built into a container. So what should we do now? Well, let's go and actually build our Docker container. Let's go to the Docker file and observe the Docker file. This is more or less of what a standard Docker file would look like. The only thing that I've added here is the flag for vendoring, because I want to use the vendoring support. And then I'm using a multiple layers for this file. I'm using multiple files into a single one so that I have everything compact and I don't have to deal with deployment and run files. In this case, because we are deploying to Kubernetes, we'll just need to run this. So to build this, sorry. And to do that, we can go here and say build Docker. But let's configure it a bit so that it gives us a bit more information. So let's say this is the Docker dev run configuration. I do not want to run the build image. And I want to use this as Docker dev, Docker-dev, sorry, with the latest version here. Cool. So when I hit run, it's going to run. So I'm going to close this. And if I go back here, it's going to say build image for Docker dev. Now, we'll wait a bit, and you may say, well, you said that there's a mode file and so on, but there's no mode file, right? Like there's no vendor folder, which is correct. You'll see that, well, there's a problem. How to fix this? Well, you can bring up the terminal in the IDE, and let me make this a bit bigger, or use the same shortcut as before with view mode window to make this a full window. And let's say go mode vendor. That's it. If I look at our IDE and bring up the vendor directory, all our dependencies are there, and I can be sure that everything is okay. Cool. So let's go back to our file and try once more. Now our Docker server will do the build process for us and so on. And while we do that, we can actually have a look a bit at the Docker plugin and observe that we have both images and containers running. And when the build has completed successfully or not, we'll see that the images here will give us a bit more information, and we can see the build log. Cool. So this is done. And if we go back to our service, let's see if it picks it up automatically. We can see that, yes, it did. Like it literally worked. So our service works. How can we verify this? Well, I could go back and open a browser and so on, but I don't particularly want to do that. So let's say I'm going to use the navbar again. And I'm going to say new file, HTTP request. And the HTTP request file will require a name. Let's say check. What this HTTP file allows us to do is it allows us to run requests, HTTP requests, straight from the IDE. And we get a bit of assistance as well here. So you can say HTTP. Well, I want, yes, HTTP, localhost here. And I want port 8080 because that's where my service runs. And I think that's about it. I don't want any other headers and so on. But if you're used to more with the curl syntax, you can say convert from curl, and this will convert the curl syntax into its syntax, or you have examples, which allows you to see examples. So anyway, let's run this. Use Alt-Enter, run, and this is actually not going to work. And it's correct, it's not going to work, right? Because I have the wrong port here. Not remembering which port I put in my web YAML file, I can invoke the recent locations and say filter by the web YAML file and see that, oh, I actually have the node port of 30,800. Okay, so let's switch this a bit here and switch our port correctly. And when we run this, perfect, it works. I get back a response, although it doesn't look like the one I'm looking for. Like, I'm expecting to get a 200. Everything should be fine. What we can see here quickly before we switch to a way to debug our code is that we have the HTTP reply headers. We have the message body, and it automatically would know how to use JSON, for example, or HTML and highlight it as such. And we have a bit of status at the end of the response just to give us a quick overview in case the response would jump out of the window and it would require scroll and so on. So we know that it's a 500. It took a bit of time to reply, and well, the size of the reply. Cool, but well, how do we fix this? So it means we have a problem in our application, and I guess this is the time where you would bring up a debugger, right? So the way to debug this would be to switch back to the main file, right? And say, well, I kind of think that the bug is here, like at least I can catch the bug here. And how can I do that? Well, we can put a breakpoint on this line, right? Because this is where the condition happens. But if we don't want to, for the debugger to stop our request if error is indeed nil, we need to invoke the conditions for a breakpoint and say, just stop when the error is not nil, otherwise continue. And well, error is not nil as a condition, suspend the breakpoint, yeah, all looks good, completion worked as expected. Right, what else do we need to do? Well, for this case, if we are running a debugger, we need to adjust a bit the Docker file. And I already did that ahead of time with the Docker file debug. What it does is it fetches Delve from the internet. Perhaps you would want to run this in a more stable manner and not run against master, as I am here. And then it just changes a bit the image so that we expose the port 40,000 and changes the command that it would run to actually run Delve. Right. Don't worry if you cannot copy paste this right now. This will all be provided at the end of the webinar in form of a repository. Cool. So we did this. Let's edit our configurations and change the Docker configuration that we have here. Clone this and say, well, I want to run this as a debug. And I want to have it separate because I want to switch between them whenever I want, right? I'm going to switch the Docker file, and I'm going to switch here the name here to be debug, so that we can run different images and so on, and we don't have to worry about where an image is built, if it's a debug or not. Right, go back up here, again, build image, building in progress. Now we have to wait a bit more because, as I said, I'm actually downloading Delve right now from the internet, so that's a great thing to do during a live webinar. But if all goes well, we'll see that everything is downloaded and compiles accordingly. Okay, so this works, and in the meantime, we can switch back to our deployment for Kubernetes and actually change it to accommodate for the new image that we are downloading. So here we need to change this to debug. We need to add another port, I would say. So let's change this to a 40,000 as we have in our definition. And I guess we would also need to expose this. So let's say another port here. Perfect. We have the conclusion that the image was built successfully, as it says here. Cool. So if the image is built successfully, let's go back here and use the port 40,000. We'll target the same port. And we want to expose this on the on a different node port, and in this case, it's going to be 30,804, let's say. And we give this the name of delve port so that we remember what we are doing. And yes, we could have a different deployment file, but for the sake of simplicity, it was easier to reuse the same thing. Let's apply this again to our cluster. And we can see that the pod is already up and running, while the other one will terminate in a few seconds. While this is terminating, we can also go here to run and edit configurations. So the same as we did before with find action. And we can say, well, add me a new configuration. And in this case, we want to say a Go remote. And the remote configuration will allow us to connect to Delve in the Kubernetes cluster, right? So let's do that. We have this, and unfortunately, it seems that I cannot remember the port. I think it was 30,800. I'll show you a different way to solve this problem whenever you are stuck like me, and that's writing tests. Okay, Delve is configured. If we switch back to our services and do a refresh, we'll see that our web application is deployed. Okay, all seems good. Let's go back to our main file. And, well, let's debug it. So let's say debug, right? Docker. Now, we see that the debugger connected. And again, we could pop this into a different window, but let's keep it like this for now. And let's run a request. So if I go to our check file here and I say run, I'll see the debugger stopping. And will it provide any information or not? Let's see. If I inspect the error value here, it says scan error, column index. Oh, okay. So there's an error. And I think I know where the error is. When I scan this, I should have used the pointer and not the direct value. Cool. So how do we solve this problem? Like, how do we make sure that it doesn't happen again? Well, let's write a test for this. And you'll say, well, you just wrote all the code in the main function. Like, I don't do that. It's not something that I work in my code. And I agree. We can split this into packages. How to do that? Well, first, let's extract this from here using the refactor this. And it's going to offer us a few refactoring options, including the extract method. And I just want to extract the closure, not the whole part. And let's call this with a different name. Let's call it home handler. Okay, cool. So this is a bit better now. It's not the greatest thing, but we can at least test it, right? Because it's a separate function out of the main function. What would be better? Well, better would be if we actually take this and say, move it to a different package. Okay, and let's say if I move this to a different package, where should I move it? Well, we can have a package that is called a handlers, for lack of a better word, and let's call this file home. Just press refactor because I know it's gonna, well, it's not gonna work, obviously. I just wanted to move the home handler, which is not exported, to a different package. So that means I couldn't have moved it away and still reference it, right? And GoLand told me that, and I was like, are you really sure you want to do that? No, I am not. And now I get an error here that, yes, this is a function that requires the home handler. So I'm going to export this, and I'm going to refactor it again. And this time I could actually refactor it. Okay, cool. what errors do I have here? So if I go here using the next highlighted error, it's going to tell me, well, there's no comment for this. So let's add a comment, and let's call this something like handles the home page. But I think it's something that we can do a bit better. Like, don't particularly like that we name this home handler, which is in the handler package. So if we go here and invoke rename, and this is the direct shortcut as opposed to me going through the refactor this. So it's just one thing, but I would like to change it to home. And now it's going to actually look in all the projects and so on for this. Since I'm using Go modules, there's not much to look for. And it tells me that, hey, there's a home handler in your main file, which is great because I haven't had to touch the main file, but you can also change this from your comments. And this is actually useful. And I'm going to say, yes, I want to refactor that usage as well. If I wouldn't, I would just press delete on that, and that's it. Cool. Let's jump to our main file to see that is it there or not. And what I invoked here is the recent files window. I can't make it any smaller for you to see the shortcut, but you can see all the shortcuts in your IDE. So everything looks good. Home handler is here. I have the correct packages imported. Everything looks good. Let's write the test. And because we are near the end, let's quickly write the test. I can't refactor the tests, right? Like, there's no nice feature to refactor into testing. So what I can do is I can say generate, and besides all the other implementations, I can say test for function. And this is going to write a test for me. It's going to use the table testing approach. So if this is something that's new to you, there's a great article on the GoLand blog about this. But the gist of it that we can put our test in here. And because we are in the interest of time, we are running out, and I would like to take some questions from you as well. I'm just going to reuse the test that I already typed for this here. Cool. So the red code that we see now here, it's because I don't have the SQL mock package installed. And once I have the SQL package installed, I can synchronize the project again, and everything will look okay. Cool. So let's run this with coverage because I also want to see what's the coverage that I have, right? And the Gopher will compile the test for us, and it's going to try to run them. So let's see what happens. And oh no, I have an error. How that would happen? Well, let's see what the error could be. Could it be that it received the internal error? If we go here and dig deeper, yes, it did. So, well, let's fix the problem that we had in the beginning. And how do we fix that? Well, let's go back here quickly in our home. And we said that we need a pointer here. And it would be nice if the IDE would be able to run the test after I do the change, right? So how can we do that? Well, let's go back to our test file. And if you see the run panel here, there is a button, auto test. So if I toggle that and I then go to the options for that and say, well, the delay I want to be 1 second, you can make it bigger or smaller as you need. Let's go back to our handler again and run the test after I do the change. And without me touching any keyboard, any other shortcuts or anything like that, the test has run. Now, there's a different error that I see. I wanted the home handler, let me clean this up a bit. So I wanted the handler to return a JSON, but I've got a string. Let's quickly fix that as well. Oh, and as you can see, the coverage is also automatically imported into the IDE and shown, and I can see all the green stuff, indicating that yes, the test went through there, or the red stuff that no, the test was not there. So I can hide the panel from here. So let's convert this to a JSON quickly, and that's it. We can do that by using the inject language, and I'm going to say JSON. And at the end of it, I don't want to type in this one, so I can say edit JSON fragment, and I will say something like this. Take the content from here, start typing status. So how does this need to look like? Status 200. Okay, I can hard code this. And you see the Gopher trying to run the test version now, but yeah. And I want to have the message here to actually be what we had earlier. Perhaps if I would put it in quotes, that would be better. And ta-da, this is it. We have our tests running. I have the coverage displayed. I am covering pretty good in terms of handler. Of course, I haven't wrote a test for the failing part. Let me close this tab a bit and make this a bit bigger and have it go away. So everything looks good. And the last part, as I said, would be for me to share the project with you. So what we can do straight from the IDE is share project on GitHub. And now I already configured the connection to GitHub because I also have to factor out the authentication and so on. So I don't need to make you wait for all of that. And what I'm going to do right now is share it on GitHub with you. It takes a bit of time because it needs to make sure that we pull all the repository names and make sure that when you type the name, it's not going to be a problem. And well, basically, we can say Go Microservice webinar, origin, perfect, and share. So the Gopher will now go and say, yeah, do you really want to commit all these files and so on? I'm going to say, yeah, pretty much, sure, why not? I want to commit the idea folder as well, that's fine. I want to commit the handler. I want to commit the vendor folder because it's going to be easier to test and so on, and all the files in here. And I'm going to say add. What it also does during this add and push operation is that it's going to also run GoFMT for me. So all my files will be automatically formatted and so on. And at the end of it, I'm going to receive a link to the project on GitHub. So if I open this one here in my browser, you'll be able to see the actual project here. So everything I coded right now live is now available for you to download. And with that said, I think we are done for today for the presentation, and we can answer some questions. Thank you for having me today. Let me bring up the question interface and see where we get some questions to answer to people. And I'm going to put this slide meanwhile so that you can actually see this. Okay, so there are some questions about the scaling and so on. I'm using a very poor scaling, and this is mostly for the presentation. Normally, all the windows would fit in, and you'd get a nice ID. But as a reference, I'm running on a 250% zoom in into the IDE, and then I increase the font to double size. Okay, let's see if we get any other questions from the audience here. So yes, Docker is running locally on my Windows machine in this case, but you are able to connect to a different Docker service. So for example, if I would go to the settings or preferences and type quickly here, well, I don't want the plugin Docker, that's fine. Give me a second, Docker here. In build, execution, and deployment, there is an opportunity for you to define which Docker environment you are using. You can name these, you can have as many as you want, and you can even define like if it's a Docker machine or like you have a TCP connection. And if you're using certificates, which I highly recommend for your production environment, I would recommend that you also configure this. And in my case, the Docker server is just the default running on Windows. Okay. What else? So there are some questions about some libraries in Go that are perhaps ORM libraries, and I'm going to say yes, there are. But for this demonstration, I felt that it's enough to handle all the SQL code and so on using just the database SQL and in this case SQLX package, which I find it pretty nice to help you organize and so on. It's, I would say, halfway through being an ORM, but if you need something more like Hibernate from Java or Doctrine from PHP, there are similar packages that you'll be able to find in the Go community. Yes. Okay, how to test a file upload with the HTTP file? Well, there are some examples with that. So if we go back to our check file, in here you'll find some links, and you'll see add a request, add the environment file, convert from open logs, and so on. And there's also a wealth of information on our help page. So if you go to our manual, jetbrains.com/help/go, you'll be able to find all the information for how to run HTTP files as well.
Okay, so the next question then, is there an integrated panel interfaces for running tests on GoLand, or should I just open a terminal and run Go test?
As you can probably saw in the presentation, yes, you can run tests from within GoLand. You can also use shortcuts, which is something I haven't really done for that throughout the presentation. Like you'll be able to see the shortcut attached to running the test here. You can configure your own shortcut if you want to run with coverage instead of just simple run. And I've shown how to run the auto test so that you don't have to worry about that and so on.
Okay, thank you. The next question, how do you connect the DB YAML file with Docker?
So the DB YAML file basically contains just a reference here in the name of the image. And I'm using the standard Postgres image for this. I haven't done anything special and so on. And what this will do is that, because I have the pull policy set to if not present, that means that it's going to pull the image if it's not present. And if you're not sure what the pull policy means, you can always use the quick documentation feature on any of the tags here. And in this case, it's going to be giving you some documentation about what it is, and also give you some references for the actual Kubernetes documentation. And yeah, in this case, it's going to simply pull the Postgres image. If I go back to our services window here, and I have a look at the containers that are running, and I apologize if you see any misnamed Docker containers, that's Docker for you. You'll be able to see that there's a log for this, and there's also like properties. You can see the environment variable that I'm using, so the username, password, and so on. If there are any volume bindings for this and where there are, port bindings, and so on and so forth. So you'll be able also to actually browse the container if you want. And there's an article on our blog on how to actually do that and browse the contents of your Docker container.
Okay, great, thanks. And next question: why didn't you use FMC printf, but a combination of FMC printf, FMC.printf? Is there any performance or style concerns?
So I prefer to use them depend on the context, and in this particular case, I don't think there's any particular implication in the speed, because it's gonna have to do basically the same thing anyway. So if I would write to this using the write feature, or if I'm passing this as a parameter and then using fprint, it's gonna be the same. Same thing. It's just a bit neater to write, and it keeps the code a bit more compact. So yeah, optionally, I could pull this one out from here, and I would say introduce a variable, and let's say, yes, I want the whole part, and let's call this a message to make it a bit easier to see. And perhaps this one could be a different constant and so on. So like I would say, introduce constant and say here message, well, let's call it MSG, because I have a not very good talent on naming things.
Okay, yeah, thanks for such a clear understanding of that. And the next one is, why the service name was under the ports?
Sorry, which? I am not really sure.
That's this question, so I don't know which exactly.
Yeah, I'll have to come back on this one, if that's okay. Yeah, I'll answer, we'll answer all the questions if we don't have the time or so on to go through them right now. So no worries, your question will be answered.
Okay, the next question: how does the introduction of modules in Go 1.0 affect the Kubernetes part? What do you think about that?
Well, it doesn't really affect the way you would deploy services to Kubernetes. What it would allow you to do is have break out of the Go path and just write your project anywhere in your system. So you don't have to necessarily put everything under Go path anymore, which is great if you ask me. And if you're coming from other languages, it's going to feel natural for you to do. But for Kubernetes, there's nothing special. As I've shown when I was actually deploying the Docker file initially, there's a vendor flag that you can still use. So if you're used to the vendoring approach in the pre-modules world, you can still use that and have vendoring. And if you don't use that, then you'll basically have to get your dependencies from the internet as well, which you would do anyway in GoPath. It just makes things a bit simpler to develop. And like you see here, I did not have to worry about putting this directory into the GoPath, making sure that I'm under GoPath and so on. I'm just using the standard Go image to do all the building and so on.
Okay, thanks. And the next author asks that for playing with Minikube, I'm using VM-driver none, which works only with sudo writes. So I can't see any Kubernetes namespaces with GoLand Kubernetes plugin. Is there any way to see them?
Yes, so the way to see them would be to tell us about that, and we'll take it to our colleagues in the Kubernetes plugin. If there's no open issue, then I'll create one, or my colleagues will, and we'll get back to you either with a workaround or with the issue link so that you can track that. Unfortunately, I haven't used that particular system to deploy on Kubernetes, So I'm not really familiar with that. That's why I'm saying it's best if you tell us about it, and yeah, you just told us. So we'll get back to you on either a workaround or something like that.
Thanks. The next question. Could you please show us how to debug, and also is there a way to grab and let the logs queue pods?
Yeah, I shown how to debug that, so that's fine. I think it's answered. As for grabbing the logs, let's say I'm gonna go here to the pod log here, right click on it and just say, hey, pull the information, pull the log. There are also a couple of plugins. I'm not really sure if they work with the output here. It's called grep console and ideolog. They might work. I need to look into that to tell you if you can actually grep through the output or not.
Okay, thank you. And the next question, for web development, would you recommend going with plain vanilla Go or use a framework like Echo? Also, can you please recommend any good login libraries?
If I would recommend development with a framework, well, that's a debated topic in the Go community. I would say if it's easier, it depends on when you're starting with Go or you're more experienced with Go in the first thing. The standard library is what I've used today to build the service. So if we look here, it's not that different from what you would write in your framework. Maybe you would want to use a HTTP router or something to have a bit more flexibility on the routes themselves. That being said, there are frameworks that are, for example, Gene, Bigo, Buffalo, and so on. And I'm just naming a few out of the top of my head right now. Like there are far more out there that will help you get started. So if you feel that a framework is the way to go for you and get started with development, go for it. That's fine. Just make sure that you also check out the standard library features, because sometimes you might not need a full framework experience, so to speak, to get a service up and running.
Okay, great, thanks. Next question. Shouldn't we use JSON.Marshall instead of handcrafted one? I assume it will be safer even if the IDE knows and helps in JSON files. What do you think?
Yeah, sure. So you totally could take the JSON response here, where is it, and just marshal it and so on. For convenience, I typed that, but like I could always say type and then let's say MSG. Why not? Let's go with that. And then I would say something like status, and then this is going to be an integer. And I know it's going to be a JSON. Sorry for that, I'm using the wrong template. Right, so JSON status, and I can also type the message here. So string, and then I want to use JSON here as a message. So now I could definitely say that, yeah, the message is actually a part of the of this. I could say, okay, fill fields, let's say with 200, and I want to move the initializing part from here all the way to here, right? And then instead of MSG, I would probably have whatever my message was, right? So hello visitor, and then visitor ID, right? And then that, and let's delete one of the visitor IDs because we actually don't need two of them. So yeah, I could say that. Should I do it? Well, maybe next time I'll do that instead. I'm not sure.
Okay, thanks. The next question is more request, and Asher asks us to provide your live templates. What do you think about that?
Sure, I can provide that. The only live template that I really used right now is the one that you can find here under live templates. Give me a second. See, it's easier if I use search filters quickly. So here, and there's a bunch of others that I have. Sorry for the screen again, but DBDS is here, for example. And there's an upcoming webinar when I'm gonna actually teach you how to write your own live templates. So there's no necessarily need for copying just my templates. You can actually take your own code and convert it to templates and so on. I'm going to leave this here a bit more.
Okay, next question is, why did it show the JSON error in the end?
JSON error in the end. Well, because it wasn't a JSON. So, well, I have to format it as a JSON and so on, the response. And yes, maybe next time I should probably go with the JSON output format.
Okay, yeah, we also have several requests to share the repo URL here. Can we do this?
Yeah, sure. So let me see if I have the browser opened again. But it's under my GitHub account. So that should be fine. Let me see. So it's under DL Sniper on GitHub, and it's Go Microservice webinar. Let me make this a bit bigger. So there's a question about OpenAPI Swagger, which I've seen it, and sorry for taking this straight out of the pile. Yes, there will be support for that in 2020.2. We'll announce 2020.2 sometime in the future. There's a blog post about the features that you'll see upcoming in that and what we plan to work on. For now, I think you will have to use IntelliJ IDEA Ultimate if you want to get that plugin working.
Yeah. Next question. What is the best way to handle DB close connection in Go?
So DB close connection, well, it depends on the library you're using and how you're using it. I would say that if it's possible and you can do it, always try to close the connection as soon as possible, because for most of the libraries, it will return it to the poll, to the connection poll, and then it can be reused and so on. But then again, it also depends on the application and if it's better to keep it open or not if you plan to do more queries. The only thing that I would really advise for is that if your code can panic, and for example, this is one of the reasons I'm using SQLX, it's that it actually does all the querying for me and so on. And I don't have to worry about all of this. It's gonna be the idea of like close it as soon as possible with a defer statement. So type as soon as you open the connection, a defer to close it after you check if the connection is established, of course. So you can say defer, close connection, and then move on with the rest of the code.
Yeah. Next question. Are there any ways to run tests automatically before committing to GitHub?
If there are tests, ways to test this, well, I actually don't remember. So let's see. If we open up the commit changes, and what you see here is the new panel format for commits, but it's not necessary to use it. You can switch back to the old one. So it does not seem that we are able to run tests, I guess. That's a good feature request to run the test before. You can perform code analysis, and as I said, you can perform Go FMT. So you don't necessarily need to run save. In fact, if you notice throughout the webinar, I did not use save at all, because the IDE does that for me anyway, and I don't need to run Go FMT on save. Like I can commit on, like I can format on save, right?
Okay. Yeah. Next question. Next, after ask us to share the plugins you installed during the presentation. So yeah, can we do that?
Okay, so let's go here to the plugins. So I have the Gopher plugin, which will make you, like, it's probably the best plugin ever. It's going to make you the progress bar into a Gopher. Every Gopher should have that. I have Key Promoter X, but it's disabled because this would add a bit of noise. I highly recommend this plugin, and please use it, especially if you start learning the IDE. What this will do is this will give you a possibility to learn shortcuts as you use your interface with your mouse. So if you're new to the IDE and want to learn the shortcuts, let me restart the IDE while I talk about this. You'll be able to learn that, and I'm going to show you shortly how the plugin works. Let me touch the IDE back. So the Gopher progress bar, everything that you need. Okay, and we are back on track. While the Gopher loads, let's go for other plugins. Kubernetes, the plugin that I installed. As I mentioned before, not all the plugins are compatible with our live install, so some of them still need a bit more work, either from our side or from the outer side. The macOS key map, so that you can actually see the key maps when I'm pressing shortcuts and so on. I have the Makefile support, Node.js, because I sometimes have to do that. Presentation Assistant is the one that brings the shortcuts that you're typing and so on at the bottom of the screen, and that's useful if you do pair programming, so that's going to be useful. Properties files, because I sometimes need to do that. Protobuf for an upcoming article. Rainbow Bracket is another plugin that I like, and it makes all the colored brackets and so on. Really cool plugin. SAS, time management, time tracking, and TOML. And then probably that's it. Like, there's not much more that I downloaded. You can quickly filter using download, and yeah, it's basically the same plugins that I mentioned. The rest are bundled.
Thanks, Lauren. The next question. Anasher asked us to imagine if we want to divide a project in two microservices, and the first microservice is responsible for sign up and login, and the second one is responsible for interacting with database. How these two microservices will communicate? Will the author have to use two different project folders with each project having their own Go module files?
Yes, I would say yes. If you have to use different services, go for two different projects using Go modules. Unless you go for the idea of mono repository with one repository to rule them all, but in that case, you will have different issues to build up the dependencies, build the applications whenever you want to deploy them and so on. Personally, I think that if you're just starting with microservices, go for the one repository per application until you figure out like what's the correct boundary and so on, and then try to see how that works. It's going to be easy to copy paste the pipeline. You just need to change the name of the repository that you're deploying, hopefully. Especially if you, like I said in the beginning, if you template some of the files, like the Docker file, for example, that can be templated. That's fine. I call this the server binary. So it doesn't really matter like what I'm building. It's going to be server anyway. And yeah, it's going to make things a bit easier to figure out in the beginning.
Okay. The next question is, do we have the complete setup of the environment to follow, like a tutorial?
Except for the plugins I've just shown and the fact that I entered the Zen mode here. I will show you some other tips and tricks on how to customize the interface, but it's the default IDE. I'm running the default key maps. I have the JetBrains mono font. The only thing that I did enable was the font ligatures. And that's the thing that transforms your fonts into using exclamation mark and equals to something like, so instead of this and that, you get the equal sign bar. And that's it. Like, I'm running pretty much the stock IDE right now. If you would go on our website, download it, install it, and you'd have the same environment as I have almost. Download the Gopher plugin.
Thanks. The next question. Are most of the action do you use covered by shortcuts? Do you mostly use keyboard?
Yes, most of the actions are covered by shortcuts. And there are a couple of ways to learn them. For example, the plugin that I showed earlier, Key Promoter X, it has a feature here which actually prompts you, like it brings up a message and says, hey, you've used the git command a few times. Here's the shortcut for it. But if it doesn't have a shortcut, it's going to say, well, let me actually find a panel without a shortcut. What would be, well, Key Promoter X, I guess. It doesn't name itself, right? So there's a shortcut for every panel. I'm not lucky right now. It would prompt you for setting a shortcut. With Key Promoter X, you'd be able to like learn the shortcuts that you're missing. And let me make this a bit bigger. So for example, Control B. I've pressed that a lot, or better said, I could press that a lot, but I use the mouse a lot. And well, maybe it's time to improve that. Can reset the statistics and so on. Besides Key Promoter X, the IDE also can help you with the help key map reference. And this is going to give you a key map reference of the IDE common actions and so on, and what we think you'll find useful. This is on my computer, so no need to copy the address. But it will be on your computers as well. And I highly recommend the productivity guide. So if you don't know about this help productivity guide, will actually be your best friend in learning the IDE features, along with the next feature that I'm going to show you. What this does is basically it tells you, so there's a feature called basic code completion. And you can use control space to address it. So let's sort by, since I use it, let's sort by something that I never used, like the surround statement with. And now I have more information. And if I look at how this looks like and what it does, then it allows me to learn the IDE shortcuts. So what I recommend is, besides the tip of the day, which shows at the IDE start, go to Help Productivity Guide and have a look at that. It's going to help you understand features of the IDE that you are not using. For example, go to symbol. I don't use go to symbol, but maybe I should. And finally, the other thing that allows you to learn the IDE, it's something that we actually added a couple of releases ago, if I remember correctly. And let me close this project as well. And it's going to be the tutorials section here. So let me close a bit the projects here. So under the tutorials section, you'll be able to find various tutorials and features that we release with each new version of the IDE. And what you can do is, for example, let's take this one, 2020.1, and it's going to allow you to understand the features that we've released. It's not a full list of all the features that we released in a release, but it's a good start to like give you what we think are the highlighted features for that release. And you can see all of them here. You can also navigate to, for example, Hitchhiker Guide and see another list of features and so on and so forth.
Thanks, Florian. Next question. How do you display the pop-up to show the parameters type and name of functions?
Okay, let me click somewhere in the code. And the shortcut is parameter info or Control P or Command P on macOS. And sometimes it will pop up automatically when you actually type. So FNT let me type without a problem. You invoke it and that's it.
Okay, thanks. And a couple of questions more. Just a second. Okay, great question. Is there any good way to work with Helm via GoLand?
Yes, there is. We actually have support for Helm in GoLand. And I will try to bring up the help on this one because, well, I don't have anything right now to actually show to you. So if you search for GoLand Helm, you'll see a blog post from our colleagues in the IntelliJ IDEA team. And what you'll see here is applicable to GoLand as well, because it's going to be used by the same Kubernetes plugin. And basically, when you install Kubernetes plugin, you get Helm support as well. It's something that I could have mentioned. And what you'll see here is the support that we have for Helm at the time of release. So this was in 2018, a bit old. But if we go here, well, this is still help. Let's go to the Kubernetes support here. So you'll be able to get more information in the help part. So JetBrains.com help Go Kubernetes and Helm support. And you're able to see the information. We support custom resource definitions as well.
Oh, yeah, and the last one question. Did we deploy Postgres on localhost as a separate Docker container?
Yes, so this, let me switch to the project itself. So if I go to the project again, when we deployed the database here, so when we were in the database YAML file, we actually deployed this under Kubernetes cluster. So if I were to bring the window back again and connect to the Docker host, I would be able to see that. And I can see the workload as well here. So I can see the database working, and this one was separated as, sorry, this one is the correct database.
Yeah, so thank you, Florin. Thank you everyone for joining us, and see you soon on our next webinar. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you for having me today and for being with us today.